The greatest threat to a freediving spearfisher is blackouts. While sharks are a threat, definitely, most definitely, they're something that tends to get more hype because they're more ferocious, they make a better story. But blackouts will actually claim more people. So it's important as a freediving spearfisher to be aware of what is a blackout, what are some of the signs of a blackout that it may occur, what are some of the mitigation steps you can take to reduce the risk, and if it does happen, what actions can we take to remedy the situation right then and there. So I just want to go into some of the steps. In short, a blackout is where you run out of oxygen and your brain shuts down, and then you sink down to the bottom of the ocean or the bottom of the pool if you're training in a pool, and you will die because you cannot breathe underwater. It's really that simple. But there are two different processes to do with blackouts. The most widely reported is a shallow water blackout. That's the most common and most well known. But there's also a deep water blackout, which tends to happen with much more experienced divers. So I'll just go into those. So deep water blackout, that's where a diver will go down to the bottom and they will force themselves to stay down there when they're usually waiting for a fish. They might be sitting on top of a rock and just waiting to ambush the fish, and they'll just sit there and sit there. They'll get urges to go up and breathe. The triggers will be there. They might even get some contractions, but they'll just push through them and they'll just stay there as long as possible, and they will black out on the bottom. Now, there's been stories of guys being found in ambush positions with the gun extended, and the gun's still in their hand, and they're just blacked out. They're just dead. So that is something to be aware of. You just have to be careful. You can't just push yourself to these extreme limits and not expect some consequences with that. Shallow water blackouts, far more common. This can be experienced divers, intermediate divers as well, very vulnerable to this. Beginners, not so much. Because if you're a beginner diver, when you dive down, the urge to breathe is so extreme that it's really hard to fight that. So most beginners won't black out. But yes, the intermediate divers, particularly young males, tend to be the group that are in the risk category because they're pushing themselves. They're a little bit brave, a little bit arrogant sometimes, pushing themselves beyond their limit, competitive with one another, and they'll push themselves beyond their limits and actually black out. And they can lose their lives, and their families may never see them again if they're not careful with what they're doing. So shallow water blackout, you go down too long, you expend too much energy, maybe too much aggression, too much kicking down, too much kicking on the bottom. By the time you're coming up, you're low on oxygen, but you think, oh, I'm at risk here, but I'm going to make it. And you come up, and then you get to about the last 5 meters, and this is what happens. Your lungs actually, as they re-expand, they start to suck oxygen out of your bloodstream. It's just a natural process because they're going back to their normal state. They've been compressed and they re-expand, start sucking their oxygen out, and that very quickly drops the oxygen level in your blood right at the last part of the dive. And so as you're coming up, you'll actually not get enough oxygen in your brain will shut off and your whole system will shut down, and then you'll actually fall down, start sinking. And if one of your mates is not there watching, you're probably going to sink to your death. One of the most important risk mitigation factors for blackouts is to dive as an individual, to dive within your capabilities. So you will know, I can do this sort of depths, I can do this sort of time. They'll have your sort of base level, but then you need to factor in on the day because there's a lot of variables in this equation. If you've not slept well the night before, if you've been drinking, if you went out drinking the night before, you had alcohol in your system, maybe you've had a tummy bug, maybe you've had a flu, maybe you've eaten something that morning that doesn't sit right, maybe the ride out in the boat was a bit rough and you're a bit tired, maybe there's a number of other factors. Some days you just don't feel it. Some days you feel great, some days you don't. You need to be aware of how your body is performing on the day before you just go, okay, I can always do these depths, I can always do these times. That's not the case. You have to feel what's going on the day and stay within those boundaries. One of the really important risk mitigations is to dive in a buddy system. If you're going out to deeper waters where blackout's going to become more of a risk, dive in a buddy system, one up, one down, watch each other right to the surface and then a few seconds beyond, particularly on those dives where they've pushed themselves. because you can actually black out a few seconds after you've taken your breath, because it takes a while for the gas to get converted into oxygen into your blood, and then that blood to get to your brain and to keep your brain conscious. So you can look for those things. Other things is just you get to know their dive buddies. So it really helps to have a good team that you're experienced with. So you get to know their traits. So you'll see someone come up and you'll know what they're capable of, and then you'll see them do something different and go, well, they've really pushed themselves then. Or even their behaviour on the way up becomes fragmented. Maybe they start to not kick correctly, they start to come up and not in a straight line. That's a signal that their brain is starting to experience motor function problems, and then you need to focus them and watch and make sure that they don't hit a blackout. You black out, you'll see their arms will flare out and they'll start to sink back, depending on how they're weighted. And you, as the dive buddy, you have the responsibility to save their life. Dive down, pull them up to the surface. So the dive buddy is very, very important. Particularly, you'll always have those divers who want to push themselves. So those ones are the ones at risk, and the ones you need to focus on. Some other things to be mindful of is to look when you're diving with each other and someone's pushing it throughout the day. You get the feeling there. Just to look to their lips. If you see their lips starting to look like a bluish tinge, that means they're really pushing themselves, and their actual oxygen levels are starting to deplete. And it can get worse if they keep diving, keep hitting long, hard dives. These little triggers like that, they should start to flag in your mind, go, okay, this person is pushing themselves. So I need to either tell them to stop it, or if they're not going to stop it, I need to watch them because they're at risk. Reel guns are another factor. A lot more people will black out and die with reel guns than with rig lines. The reason for that is in the buddy system, when a diver dives down, you can follow their rig line and you kind of know where they're going to come up within a range. You're going to know where they're going to come up. But if with a reel gun, the diver can go down and they get lost because they go out of sight. And you know, if you're in current, it can be a problem. You don't know where they are. The current's probably different at the surface as it is to the reef. You can get separated. That alone is a risk. But there's also the problem with the reel gun. When you shoot a big fish, you've got to put some tension on it on the way up, and that drains you as you're kicking up. It drains all your energy. So reel guns are a lot more risk. I don't dive with reel guns. I have a couple of times. There's some advantages, obviously, to hunting and the freedom you get with it, but they're a lot riskier, so that's a factor you might want to consider. There's nothing better than having a buddy there right above. Your float will be near them. They'll be watching the rig line down, and then they'll see it loop back up as you come up. And you've got your little dive angel there watching over you. Diving with a snorkel in the mouth is a problem when you black out because it creates a funnel. The water can go just straight down, throat, into your lungs, and that causes all sorts of problems. If you pull the snorkel out, which is what I do as I dive, your mouth will stay shut if you black out. It will stay shut for about 45 seconds before the body will force a breath. And if you're underwater and you breathe in a lot of salt water into your lungs, that's a recipe for disaster. You've got to go to hospital, and that's even if you make it there. So it's ideal to actually pull the snorkel out when you dive under. So what do you do if a blackout actually occurs? Well, the first thing you need to do is get them to the surface. So you're going to swim down. It's probably not deep, but you might be a fair distance from them. So you're going to have to swim over, swim down, pick them up. The problem with swimming them up is your fins can hit them and it can slow you down. Ideally, what you want to do is to hold one hand underneath the jaw like that. It'll keep it shut just to make sure it doesn't open for any reason, and the other hand can hold the back of the head. So you're holding them like that, and then you can push them up. The reason you push them up, that lifts them, assuming they're about your same height, that'll lift their fins up, so your fins will be clear of their fins underneath. So you can actually kick and you can get good propulsion. You're sealing the airway, and you're going to be able to kick them up as fast as possible. Now when you get to the surface, you're going to rip the mask off. The reason you do that is you want to expose as much of the skin. There's a lot of sensors in here, and their brain is still working. It's still working. So if they start to feel air, they may actually just start breathing. The next thing you want to do is blow on them. So actually get those sensors firing. So you're going to blow and you're going to talk, because their brain is still, the hearing is one of the last things to go. So you're going to talk to them, you're going to say breathe, breathe, breathe. You can say the name, breathe, 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 and that will trigger them. Oh yeah, okay, I'm going to start breathing. Now that will usually bring back most cases. Most of the time, that will bring back 99% of people who have blacked out, because they've just temporarily run out of oxygen, and they'll come back. There may be a very rare case where that doesn't happen and you're going to have to do a rescue breath. So that is just pinching over the mouth. It's like CPR. You're just going to pump a couple of breaths into them, and hopefully that gets them working. So that is really what you need to do. The other thing that may be the case is a SAMBA. So SAMBA is not actually a blackout, but they've lost motor function, so they're trembling, and it's called a SAMBA because it looks like a Samba dance. So you're just going to hold them up out of the water. They'll still be breathing. Just hold their neck above the water line, and that won't let any water in them, so they'll actually just breathe, and they'll come back. They just need a little bit of time. Just watch them. One of the other things when you pull them back is they probably won't have any memory of the blackout. If it's happened to them, this is the first time it's happened to them, they'll probably push you away and go, "What are you doing?" So it's it's not very appreciative, but that may happen. So you've got to be aware of that. If they've been around the traps a long time, they'll know straight away. They'll know, "Oh, I must have blacked out. Don't remember it, but that's what happened." So it's really important to follow all those things. You can save a life, and then you can keep diving with your friends for as long as possible. My personal experiences with blackouts, I haven't actually had a blackout per se. I have had a SAMBA where I chased a fish too deep and spent too much energy swimming along the bottom, and a mate actually held my head above the water until I calmed down. I've seen a friend that blacked out in a pool when I was training with them, and he sank to the bottom of the pool and I pulled him up. And the pool's actually the best place to have a blackout because the variables are contained and it's not deep, it's clear, and you know you're training, so it could happen. The ocean is far more risky environment. I've had a couple other mates black out in the water in the ocean. I wasn't in the water at the time. I was in the boat one time, the other time wasn't there. But without buddy divers pulling them up, they would have died and they would have been gone forever. So I can't stress enough how important it is to be aware of the risk of blackouts. And when you're doing that deeper dive and pushing yourselves, just make sure you have a buddy system. Don't go off and do your own thing. Just have a buddy system and you will save lives, and you'll get to spend a lot more time diving together.